Just one final bit of breaking news. We're hearing that the Russians are reporting that Ukraine has now used these ATACMS ballistic missiles. More on that later.
Yeah, it looks like an escalation is coming. Okay.
This morning, Ukraine fired U.S.-made missiles into Russia for the first time. That's according to officials in Moscow. The move comes just 2 days after President Biden gave Ukraine permission.
And a major escalation on the 1,000th day of the war. The attack comes just 2 days after the Biden administration gave Ukraine the green light to use the weapons against targets inside Russia. The White House policy change comes after North Korean troops were deployed to help drive Ukrainian soldiers out of Russia's Kursk border region. Overnight, Russian President Putin signed a new doctrine saying any major aerial attack against Russia could prompt reprisals with nuclear weapons. A spokesperson for Putin says this adds fuel to the fire.
This news comes a few hours after Russian President Vladimir Putin said the country has a right to respond to an attack like this one with nuclear weapons.
Putin has a new warning for the United States after President Biden authorized Ukraine to use long-range missiles supplied by the U.S. to strike inside Russia.
The Russian anti-missile system apparently downed 5 out of 6 of these missiles. And the Russian Defense Ministry says Ukraine hit Russia with these missiles.
Feels like a significant escalation. Does the U.S. and the U.S. actually, and President Biden gave the blessing to Vladimir Zelensky to use these very big missiles a couple of days ago. Does that come with the guarantee that if Russia escalates, the U.S. is there to protect them?
Well, I think that this is a slew of questions that we do not yet have the answers to, Francine. And just to recap some of the news that we just got in the last few minutes, because this all feels fairly significant, is what we got from Vladimir Putin was signing into a decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response to any kind of massive conventional attack on its soil. That would include drones, that would include presumably long-range missiles, that Russia would view aggression against itself or its allies by non-nuclear state backed by other nuclear powers as a joint attack. In summary, basically saying that if there was an attack on Russia by a member of a coalition that will be seen as an attack by sort of the full coalition, i.e., even if it's a non-nuclear power aided by a nuclear power, that would be seen as a joint attack. This is something that Putin has been talking about signing into as a decree since September. This is officially happening now.
The fact that we knew that Ukraine were going to be able to use these missiles in a slightly different way, was certainly with a further reach. This perhaps comes as no surprise. The fact that Russia says that these missiles have been used, can we believe them here?
It's extraordinary because of the pace here. I'm not sure it's necessarily unexpected to some degree, because we have known that Ukraine have been in possession of ATACMS missiles like this to hit targets inside of occupied areas of Ukraine. And so in theory, I suppose the target list would have already been in their possession, and this simply being a matter of Kiev deciding that they wanted to use this new US permission. But it comes on the 1,000th day of a war so full of unexpected moments here, and I think we are now going to have to see whether Ukraine steps forward and officially acknowledges that this indeed was an ATACMS missile launching this particular strike. Just in the last 48 hours, President Volodymyr Zelensky has sort of hedged that, generally saying, look, we're not going to necessarily announce this. Missiles will speak for themselves. Well, certainly that news has indeed emerged. What could Russia's response be? They have been unclear at this particular point, previously warning that if these missiles were fired by Ukraine, supplied as they are by the United States, that would essentially be NATO, the US and Europe joining the war, becoming a party to the conflict. Putin has not reiterated that himself since this, but indeed his foreign ministry made similar noises. So it's a key moment here, certainly.
Vladimir Putin appearing to threaten to use nuclear weapons if Ukraine fires American-made missiles into Russia. The Kremlin saying the doctrine was updated in response to what it calls the new situation. The new Russian policy essentially authorizes the use of nuclear weapons in response to what it calls, quotes, critical threats of aggression using conventional weapons. Now remember, President Biden lifting restrictions on the ATACMS ballistic missiles, which are, of course, conventional weapons, essentially allowing them to be fired into Russia. Putin has made nuclear threats before that have proved to be hollow. A senior Ukrainian military source telling me this is blackmail, but also warning nuclear weapons are a Pandora's box that shouldn't be opened. This move likely aimed as much at President-elect Trump, who's promising to end the war when he takes office, but he'll make that all the harder.
Несложно предположить географию ответа в случае, если короткий пресс-релиз Белого дома станет реальностью. Под угрозой без малого все европейские столицы, если наши ракеты встанут в Калининграде. Берлин, Варшава, все Прибалты, Париж, Бухарест, Прага. Конечно, американские базы в Германии. Гармии Шпартенкирхен, казармы Патча, Шпангдалем, Рамштайн. Особое внимание Британии, нашему традиционному врагу, так как против нее будет работать значительная часть Северного флота. Под удар Вашингтон ставит не только Лондон, но и Манчестер, Бирмингем, крупнейшую военно-морскую базу Девонпорт, Клайд в Шотландии, где король хранит ядерные ракеты «Трайдент», Портсмут и Чатамскую верфь в графстве Кент. Британия в самом уязвимом положении. В принципе, достаточно 3 ракет, и эта цивилизация рухнет.
Just quickly, Russia's also threatened nuclear escalation. Are you comfortable with that when people at home are watching this, worrying that you could put us at risk?
Well, it's very
Nuclear war?
important. It's very important that we're steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor,
Even if it unleashes nuclear war?
Russia has to be the one that makes the move to stop this war. It's within their gift, but we must support Ukraine. It's impacting not just Ukraine; it's impacting the rest of the world, including the UK.
Is your message to viewers back home that there will not be a nuclear war, because that is what Russia is threatening?
My message is that we need to ensure that Ukraine is put in the best possible position. This is 1,000 days of conflict, and there is a very high cost if Russian aggression is seen to pay off.
A remarkable series of events, starting with President Biden with this major change in policy, allowing Ukraine to use these longer-range missiles inside Russia. And then what we saw was Putin signing this declaration, revising the nuclear doctrine that you mentioned, that would it basically declared that a conventional attack on Russia by any nation supported by a nuclear power would be considered a joint attack. And then we see Ukraine using these long-range missiles. It's yet to be seen what Russia's response will be, but this would obviously be seen as quite an escalation by Moscow.
Yeah, look, I mean, they saw the American decision as an escalation. The Americans saw the decision by Russia to station North Korean troops on the front lines as an escalation by Russia. And so we have that ladder, people continually climbing. I'm not sure really what Vladimir Putin's statement today in his amendment of the nuclear doctrine, outside of the scariness of the words amendment of the nuclear doctrine, actually necessarily does. It essentially says that conventional attacks by multiple parties against Russia could potentially lead to responses by Russia towards those parties. It's nuanced, highly nuanced, but it's part of a pattern that we've seen where Moscow feels potentially under threat, or feels it has to make a sort of bombastic statement that it reaches for the phrase to remind people that it is indeed a nuclear power. Do I necessarily think this means that Vladimir Putin is getting ready to launch nuclear weapons? No, certainly not. He appears to have shied away from that significantly over 1,000 days of war where Russia has experienced multiple conventional military defeats. Indeed, it's been invaded by a much smaller army, Ukraine, in just the last 4 months. But I do think it's a bid by them to try and please a domestic audience who might be wondering exactly what juice Russia has left at this particular moment. And I think it is his way of suggesting that this is perhaps Moscow's response. Do they necessarily have the military might to take on NATO in full? Well, almost certainly not. They're struggling to defeat Ukraine. Do they necessarily have the desire geopolitically to inflame this conflict? Remember, China is a key ally in here and probably doesn't want to see that happen ahead of a Trump presidency. So I think if we do see, outside of this statement by the Kremlin head Vladimir Putin, any further responses from Russia, you might end up looking at sabotage. There have been many accusations that Russia's been behind exploding packages and courier depots. Indeed, we have reports from Lithuania and Germany that undersea internet cables towards Scandinavia have been damaged in the last 48 to 72 hours. That's, I think, where we'll potentially see this exacerbate. But look, be in no doubt here at all. We're into a very different part of the war here. American-made and supplied weapons are being fired into Russian territory. That's a place that we frankly never imagined we'd get to 1,000 days ago.
The Biden administration just approved the use of American-made long-range ballistic missiles by the Ukrainian army to strike targets within Russia. In response, Russia says it will react with nuclear force if any of those missiles land within Russian territory.
You have the Russian president up until now warning the West of dire consequences should the US, or the UK for that matter, grant the Ukrainians the permission to use these longer range missile systems. For the US, it sees it the ATACMS ballistic missile. For the UK, it's the Storm Shadow cruise missile. That should they grant that permission, that they are playing with fire, that they could trigger a global conflict. And it's no coincidence, therefore, that the Russians today are announcing or finalising what was already in the planning, this lowering of the threshold of when Russia would consider using nuclear weapons in response to an attack. Under this updated doctrine, the Russian military could resort to a nuclear strike if the country is under conventional attack, and which is a lowering with, for example, the kinds of missiles that you're seeing at the moment, which is a different change of words before the caveat of when a nuclear strike, a nuclear retaliation would be considered by Russia was in response to a nuclear attack or a conventional attack that threatened the very existence of the state. Of course, we know, and British and American officials repeatedly say, that Russia does not want a nuclear war because there would be no winners. But clearly an incredibly important and worrying, well, but obviously unsurprising development.